Good morning, everyone. Chris Green, the History Chap, Friday morning at in a reasonably dreary Worcester. At least it's not raining today. So, I've cut myself today with my razor. That was clever, wasn't it? Welcome, everyone. Hope you all had a great week so far. And a special hello to Jen in Cumbria. It stopped raining in Cumbria. There's a reason there's lakes in Cumbria, isn't there, Jen? And Dave, hi from sunny Norfolk. Okay, so in one country, we're already getting totally different weathers. I don't know where Welsh Muslim Dave, I don't know where you're coming in from. I'm maybe Wales, but I'm making a massive assumption there. Stick in where you're coming from, Dave. And Davey, 1602, welcome to you as well. And again, folk, if you're watching, say hello and say where you're watching from. Always nice to know where people are in the world. Never ceases to amaze me just how many folk watch my videos from all around the world. I mean, Britain's the big place. Interestingly, not the majority. It's the biggest of all the groups, but then it's very much, I guess, what we'd call the Anglosphere. So we've got a lot of Americans, a lot of Canadians, Aussies, Kiwis, and then we've got sort of in the next place, that's sort of almost in running order: US, UK, US, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and South Africa and Ireland are all sort of together there. And then beyond that, we have people from Philippines. We've got people from Argentina. I've got someone recently from Kenya. South Africans, I've just mentioned, haven't I? I've got folk from Germany, some supporters from Norway and Netherlands as well. So, yeah, it's great to hear where everyone's coming from. Oh, blimey, now we've got a right roll. Hello, everyone. So, Caerphilly in South Wales, great place, great castle at Caerphilly as well. Thank you. And David in New Zealand, thank you very much. Salford. Yeah, not as picturesque as Caerphilly maybe, or New Zealand, but Salford I know well from living in Cheshire for many years. It's bucketing down here in beautiful Brom. Well, I'm just down the road from Birmingham, mate, and Davey, 1602, and at the moment, famous last words, Worcestershire, we're okay on. San Fernando Valley, wow, Tim, I'm hoping the weather's nice there for you. Hello to Jack Cade. Freezing temperature from Eric. Tacklebury, good morning from sunny Northumberland. Beautiful county. And an area that I do want to do some talks about in the future, because I'd like to delve back into sort of what English folk would call Anglo-Saxon history. Scots and Welsh wouldn't call it that, but that whole period from sort of the Romans and beyond the Romans right up to 1066, and of course Northumbria features very heavily in that story. And of course, just to wind up with my Scottish supporters, and all my Northumbrian friends love this one when we point out that Northumbria actually included the area of Scotland that now includes Edinburgh, or for a period of time in its history, and they like to point that one out. Anyway, bucketing down in Caerphilly. Yeah, but the Castle Ducks are very happy. Good morning from Altrincham as well. Hello, Thomas. Nice to see you, mate. So, just as a bit of housekeeping, for those of you who haven't watched one of these before, haven't joined me for one of these live sessions, compared to my normal videos, okay, this is totally unscripted. I've got a few notes just to keep me on track. But this is totally unscripted. You're not going to get any visuals. So if that's not your cup of tea, if you don't like freewheeling history, this is more like us sitting and having a coffee in Costa or Starbucks or down the pub. And actually, it's how I started the History Chap, just talking to mates. And it was during COVID when some of them said, God, you don't have to talk a lot of history back in the days when we were allowed to go to pubs and things. So why don't you tell some history stories on YouTube? And that's how it all started. So this sitting around and chit-chatting. And funny enough, I was at a YouTube creators meeting recently, and there was a lovely creator I met. She's from Birmingham. She was young. She's in her 20s. And she just said, oh, yeah, I bet you've got some stories you can tell about Birmingham. And I started just giving some bits and bobs, actually all around, fundamentally around Peaky Blinders. And she was like, oh, my goodness, you really do know so much stuff stuck in that head. I've got nothing useful in my head, just lots of history. So that's what I'm doing these live sessions. And if that's not your cup of tea, then please, by all means, look at one of my other videos. There's plenty of them, over 100 now on my channel. But yeah, don't give me a thumbs down or an unsubscribe. Just accept this is another avenue of ways I do stuff, okay? And some of you will enjoy it. I know lots of you enjoy it. Last week I had well over 5,000 people watched it. So it was, that we are amongst friends, folks. Okay. So I've got my cup of coffee, different mug. Ironically, the one that I have been using was a Christmas mug. Now that we're into December, I've got my Clash of Empires mug with the Zulu shields on it, which is quite cool. That's a conference exhibition I went to earlier this year, put on in London by Ian Knight and others, and it was a great exhibition. And I did a video about that as well. But anyway, so this week, I'm going to flick it around. Normally what I'll do is do a bit of a talk all about what's been happening in my week, and then we finally get into the historical events, the anniversaries in British history. I'm going to flick it round, and we're going to go into the events first. But before I do that, just to say, coming up after the events, we will be talking about my latest video, the one that came out last night, about the Battle of Waterloo, 1815. I'm going to briefly share with you some speaking that I've been doing this week as well, including talking about the history of British pantomime, which is a bit different from the Battle of Waterloo. So can you believe I was doing the Battle of Waterloo yesterday and speaking about British pantomime? And also want to just talk about Woodbine Willie, who some of you might remember from my Theodore Hardy talk last week. So there you go. Lots of them going on. Davey1602 said, lots of Daves in the chat. Oh, by the way, those of you who haven't done one of these before, I do keep looking over here to look at the chat and trying to respond as much as I can. And again, that's something I don't do in my prepared videos, is it? Because it's all under my control there. I'll tell you, it's hard work even under my control. So let's crack into British history today or this week, okay? 3rd of December. Actually, I'll tell you what, there are some weeks, and those of you who are on my history newsletter will know this, because every week I send out a list of what's happened in British history, and I always have a story in there from one of the events. And you'll know that, and I know Jen, for instance, you're on that history on my history newsletter. By the way, there's a link to that down below if you're interested. And there are some weeks where it's like all royalty, or some weeks where it seems to be like everyone's fighting each other. The British fighting each other. And this week, strange enough, it's politicians. This week, can you believe there have been 1, 2, 3, 4 prime ministers came into office this week back in British history. And 3 of them were from the Liberal Party. And we're going to start on the 3rd of December, 1868. William Gladstone became prime minister for the first time. William Gladstone was one of the towering figures of the 19th century British politics. And I guess if you asked people who know a little bit about British history, okay, rather than grabbing some 16-year-old on the street at the minute, but if you talk to anyone who knows a little bit about British history, they will tend to say Gladstone, Disraeli, Peel. Who else might they consider? Pitt, right at the very beginning of the century, maybe Lord Salisbury, but Gladstone is definitely up there as one of the towering figures of British politics. Amazingly, he was to serve 4 times as British Prime Minister, the only person to have ever been served effectively coming into office 4 times. That's not winning general elections on the trot, a bit like Margaret Thatcher, Tony Blair, those sort of people getting back-to-back wins. This is coming into office 4 times. And this was the very first time, in the 3rd of December, 1868. And amazingly, based on what I've just said, that he came into office 4 times, he was 59 the first time he was made prime minister. And it's quite interesting, isn't it, that Gladstone is seen as one of these towering figures that seem to be all the way through sort of Queen Victoria's reign. And actually, he was a politician for most of Queen Victoria's reign, not prime minister all that time. But you tend to think of him as this sort of grizzled old man, and he must have been prime minister for years. And as I say, 59 when he became prime minister first time round. There's hope for me yet. I've got a few more years before I can become prime minister. Looking at the current mob in Parliament, it's just like a merry-go-round, isn't it? I'll throw my hat in. Who knows? I might be there in a couple of years. QA Library. Why do they call Pitt the Younger? I'll come on to that later. All right. And someone just said Gladstone. Sir Fox has said Gladstone. Absolutely. So Gladstone, 59 years old. won an election in 1868, and the news of the victory was taken to him at the Gladstone's family pad in it's Harden Castle. Still is the family home of the Gladstones, actually. Harden Castle, just near Harden, just over the Welsh border from Chester. So if you're trying to get your bearings as to where it is in Wales, just over the border in Chester, in Deeside, and built on the interestingly, going down a little rabbit hole here, built on a fair bit of money from the slave trade, or from sugar plantations, which the labour force was slaves in modern-day Guyana. And there's been some controversy in Guyana and with the Gladstone family in recent years, including this year. But anyway, not going to go down that route. He was at Harden Castle. The news was brought to him. He was chopping logs at the time. And supposedly, he turned around when he was given this news. He was sort of interrupted from his physical exertion. He used to enjoy chopping logs. That was his version of working out. And he announced that, he said, "My mission is to pacify Ireland," like you would if you'd been given some good news. And then he went on back to chopping his logs. Of course, Ireland became probably the defining issue for Gladstone throughout the rest of his premierships, through the rest of the 19th century, and caused great consternation. So split the Liberal Party, and not going down that road now particularly, but we ended up with some members of supported Gladstone with his home rule. Some people wanted Ireland to remain in the Union, and they became what were called Liberal Unionists. The most vocal, the most prominent of those Liberal Unionists was Joseph Chamberlain, who eventually he had a lot more. The Liberal Unionists ended up having a lot more in common with the Conservative Party than with their old Liberal Party, and they ended up both first working with the Conservatives in Parliament and then ultimately being consumed into the Conservative Party. And that's why officially it's the Conservative and Unionist Party to this day, because those Liberal Unionists came across. And of course, Chamberlain, you've seen in several of my videos, but principally those around the Boer War and the Jameson Raid. He was the Colonial Secretary, he was a hawk, and he was the father of Neville Chamberlain, beginning of World War II fame. Anyway, back to where we were. The Gladstone's government, this first government that he had of his four prime ministerships, actually was trying to be a reforming government. It wasn't all about Ireland. So as far as a lot of you who enjoy my history videos from the 19th century military, he, in this government, in this particular tenure office, he abolished the purchase of commissions and also flogging in the army. So, interesting. Flogging existed till 1868 in the British Army. We tend to think it was very Napoleonic, sharp and all that sort of stuff. It was going on through the Crimean War. And actually, the Crimean War was now distant memory, wasn't it? This was nearly 15 years previously. They were still having flogging. And anyway, it was illegal. It was banned during Gladstone's tenure. He also, on a social perspective, he legalised trade unions. First time that had happened in British politics. And he also introduced secret voting in elections, which up until then hadn't happened. And obviously was, not surprisingly, votes could be manipulated if the Lord of the Manor was watching which way you voted, or the factory owner, for those of you who did have a vote from factories, which wouldn't have been very many. And when we say Lord of the Manor, don't forget we're talking about not your serf, your farm workers, but like the manager of an estate would have probably had the vote. And the Lord of the Manor would have been watching which way his manager voted, and woe betide you if you voted for the opposition to the person the Lord of the Manor was supporting, who very often, depending where you were in Britain, it might have been his son who was standing for Parliament. So anyway, introduce secret voting. I'll come to the comments in a moment. I'll finish Gladstone. Okay. He also introduced the Foster's Education Act, which was the first time in Britain that we had a national framework for educating children, and basically put in place a framework that children be educated from the age of 5 to the age of 12. And that was under Gladstone. First time that had come in. Up until then, it had been real hit and miss. But now children had to be educated to the age of 12. He lost the 1874 election to Benjamin Disraeli. And it's interesting, Disraeli and Gladstone are like these two, we talked about the giants of Victorian history, politics earlier. They are like the two absolute, battle, the heavyweights, the George Foreman and the Muhammad Ali sort of British politics of the 19th century. Interestingly, their rivalry as prime ministers or leaders of their respective parties didn't actually last as long as most of us like to think in popular storytelling. But nevertheless, lost in 1874. As I say, he went on to become prime minister 4 occasions in British politics, only person ever to have done that. And when he died in 1898, he was given a state funeral, the last full state funeral, I think, if I'm right, before Winston Churchill. And at his state funeral, Westminster Abbey, and the pallbearers included, at the time, 1898, the Prince of Wales, the future Edward VII, and the Prince of Wales' son, the Duke of York, who became George V. A towering member of a person in British politics. And of course, in a lot of the stories I tell, not least the stories around the Mahdi and Sudan, where, of course, William Gladstone was really opposed. Fundamentally, William Gladstone was not an imperialist. I think he became almost like an accidental imperialist. But he believed in Britain. He had 2 things. He had a moral thing about some form of people being given freedom. This is Victorian style of freedom, I hasten to add. But equally, what he really didn't want, he was, bizarrely, despite being the Liberal Party, they were actually economically quite Thatcherite, as we describe them today. And so he believed in small government, he believed in low tax, he believed in free trade, and fundamentally he didn't see Sudan, if we're thinking of Sudan there, as any economic value to Britain and a pure drain on resources. If you sent Garnet Wolseley running around Sudan trying to conquer it, which Garnet Wolseley was all up for because he was an imperialist, then actually it would be a drain on the coffers. So the British would spend loads of money on a war that could go on for some time, and it would be of no economic advantage to Britain. And that's why in the stories of Sudan that you followed me with, that's partly why he offered the Egyptians, because Sudan was an Egyptian colony, part of an Egyptian empire, nothing to do with the British in the 1880s. And Britain had a lot of interest in Egypt. They effectively were the de facto ruler in Egypt, all a bit murky and confusing. But the Egyptians basically were losing control of Sudan to the Mahdi and appealed to Britain for help. Gladstone, based on what I've just said, had actually no intention of either propping up an corrupt Egyptian regime in Sudan, nor did he want to spend any money having a British army going to Sudan. So he basically convinced the Egyptians that they should evacuate their colony, because the writing was on the wall. We're looking a bit like Saigon in the 1970s. Get out if you can. We will help you get out by sending one of our best generals, one of our more expendable generals maybe, who's Charles Gordon, who had previously served as governor of Egypt, employed by the Egyptians. And that's how Gordon ended up in Khartoum. And of course, Gladstone had specifically said to Gordon, your job is to evacuate the Egyptians, basically leave it, echoes of Kabul recently as well, actually, if you look at it. Get out, get as many people out as you can, and then leave Sudan to the Sudanese and the tender mercies of the Mahdi and his sort of Islamist regime. And of course, basically immediately got to Khartoum, Gordon went rogue, decided that actually he was going to try and see if he could set up an alternative government to the Mahdi, at least oppose the Mahdi. Ends up getting besieged in Khartoum, and the British press now want to save their hero. And Gladstone is bounced into a war by public opinion and indeed by Queen Victoria. Snapshot of history there, but I hope that sort of puts Gladstone into perspective. The non-imperialist who ends up by default ending up in various imperialist adventures all around the British Empire. Let me just have a look at where we're at here. Sorry. I'm just whizzing back. Good day from Indonesia, and hello Sandy. Enjoyed your video on Waterloo. Fine, we will talk about Waterloo in a while. Waterloo, yeah. We've got a fair few Waterloos. Just subscribe to the newsletter. Thanks, Ryan. You'll get something every week. And of course, the newsletter is great because it tells you when I've done new videos. I also tell you when I do speaking. Normally, when I go out and do actual speaking to real live audiences, tends to be for organisations like the National Trust or the U3A, or I've got one coming up in the new year for the Friends of the Mercian Regiment down here in Worcester. So that's a great one, isn't it? And but so sometimes I wouldn't call them closed shops, but you obviously have to make. I'm not hosting them, so you'd have to talk to the hosts and see if you can blag your way in or pay an entrance fee or something. But anyway, is it possible there'll be more Boer War videos? Thomas, yes, there will be. And if you've got any particular you'd like me to cover in the Boer War, stick them in the chat now, okay? But Boer War, I have to be honest, it's a war that was a huge event at the time, internationally as well. And it wasn't necessarily to Britain's glory. I mean, Europe in particular rounded on the British. They were supporting the Boers for a whole variety of reasons, from mischief making from the German Kaiser, through to blood relations from the Dutch, through to again mischief making a bit from the French. That England's enemy must be France's friend, sort of thing, and many people from European nations actually fought with the Boers, and of course then the British had their concentration camps, which I'm not going to go into, and it actually would be a good video, but it will get all the woke people out, saying the British were, that it was the prototype for the Nazis at a push. I guess some of my South African viewers still, it's pretty raw in the Afrikaner and Boer descendants, Afrikaner community in South Africa, and it's an area of sensitivity. So, but it's probably an important one because it gets raised a lot. But anyway, put anything in about the Boer War. So anyway, Thomas, imagine being flogged and then having to wear a backpack. Yeah, back in Napoleonic army. If you're interested, folks, in this period of like the Redcoats, so after Waterloo, running through to nearest damn it, the Zulu Wars, that sort of period. So this time we're talking about where the British soldiers were still getting flogged, basically. I thoroughly recommend Warriors in Scarlet by Ian Knight. Let me just get a copy off the bookcase. If you're looking for a good Christmas present, get this one. I'm not on a commission from Ian. I've read it. In fact, he actually sent it to me to review, which is incredibly kind. Little old me reviewing a book by Ian Knight, and absolutely brilliant read. Brilliant read. Goes into things like the New Zealand Wars, a lot of stuff in South Africa, not the Zulus, but fighting the Xhosas in particular, where there were, I think it was 8 or 9 Xhosa wars over the period. Really interesting. And he talks as much about the common soldiers as he does about the officers and the elite. Okay. Anyway, throw that down there. Grab my coffee. Is it true we invented concentration camps in the Boer War? Yes and no is the answer. Sam, I don't want to go into that too much. Okay, so I'll disappoint you and maybe some others who really want an in-depth answer here. The first time the term concentration camp was ever used, and the idea of concentrating people into a camp, civilian population into a camp, was actually in the 1890s in Cuba, where the Spanish were the colonial masters of Cuba at the time. There was insurgency in Cuba, and that's where the very first time it was ever used was in Cuba. Basically, the British, and this is real nutshell, so please don't get offended, folks, if I am covering it top line. The British decided during the Boer War, having defeated the main Boer armies in a traditional European style war, in other words, the British had occupied the 2 Boer countries. Normally in British or European style warfare, when that happens, the defeated nation surrenders and the war's over. The Boers decided that what they were going to play that game. They basically just went into a guerrilla war. Huge country, South Africa, don't forget, geographically. And they were riding around the veldt, attacking British supply chains, attacking the British, and these Boer commandos, as they were racing around the veldt. So one of the ways that the British decided to stop them was to prevent them getting supplies from local people, their families. So they used to started rounding up Boer families, destroying their farms, destroying the livestock, burning the crops, everything the Boer commandos could have used. And they put these people, the civilians, into camps. The big difference between the camps and later concentration camps, okay, was Boer civilians died in the concentration camps. They died in droves. They died principally because they were neglected. There wasn't a campaign by the British to somehow wipe out the Boer people, unlike the Jews, unlike the Germans in what's now Namibia, where in their colonial period, where they actually tried to take out some of the tribes that have rebelled against them, fought against them. And through neglect, lack of medical supplies, and quite frankly, unfortunately, the man overall in charge of it was Lord Kitchener. He was more interested in fighting the commandos than he was looking after civilians. If you read a lot about Kitchener, he was a reasonably cold, uh, I heard him described as a machine. And certainly, whilst the Boers suffered in droves, actually he didn't really care too much about the welfare of a lot of his troops in South Africa either. A lot of British troops died of disease and stuff as well. So fundamentally, people rounded up, put into these camps. Many of them died. They were civilians. Not surprisingly, that is a very sore history for Afrikaners. I remember when I was brought up in South Africa, there was a man down our road. This is in Cape Town. First time his granny ever saw the sea was when she was brought to a concentration camp near Cape Town. I think the crucial word there, and just this is on my thing, is if you look at the word concentration, it was concentrating a civilian population in an area. It wasn't concentration as in let's have some ovens and some gas chambers and that sort of thing. Some of you might disagree, but I do believe that's actually where the British were coming from. Didn't really help if you were an Afrikaner Boer who was dying of diphtheria or something else in the concentration camps. A lot of women, a lot of children died there while their men were fighting on the veldt. Anyway, there we go. So there you go, Boer War. Okay. QAL Ibri. Chris, have you talked about the history behind the British Forces field gun race? That's a lot easier to talk about than concentration camps, isn't it? I haven't. It's on my list. And part of the reason it's on my list actually is my former father-in-law was in the Fleet Air Arm field gun crew that won twice at Earl's Court tournament. And in fact, the second time he did it, they established a record that was held for something like 20 odd years. It was they fast people. So I will talk about the history of the field gun race, where it came from. I won't go year by year about each event at Earl's Court. Okay. Uncle Heavy, you've just said about the US Spanish War in Cuba. Yeah, just slightly before the US-Spanish War, when the Spanish were just fighting the Cubans. Invisible Ray, am I going to do the Shangani Patrol? Yeah, is the answer. Conscious, some of you might follow Redcoat Military History here on YouTube. Chris Parkinson. Chris has just done one about the Shangani Patrol, and I had it to do in December. Bloody Chris has gone and done one, so I'll get a lot of you follow both of us. Okay, so I will give it a little bit of a break before I cover Shangani Patrol, but I do want to, in 2024, which is getting very close already, isn't it, folks? I want to cover the Shangani Patrol. I actually want to cover Cecil Rhodes. Oh, I'm a glutton for punishment, aren't I? Concentration camps, Cecil Rhodes. Let's just get England, the British Irish question up there as well, shall we? And I'll just bring it on. In fact, Chris Parkinson says to me, he says you're a lot braver than I am. He says you cover areas that I just don't want to go to. So, but they're important because they're the ones they're partly the things that actually still dictate history to this day and people's feelings, and animosities and everything else. And if you just skirt around all the nice things of history, which is lovely, and telling stories about, men winning the Victoria Cross in the First World War and Second World War, which I'm pretty adept at, you are taking away the fact that, so why does your Irish friend not wear a poppy? Why does this South Afrikaner that you know from rugby, who supports the Springboks, immediately mention Kitchener, their hackles go up? Likewise, for some Indians, if you mention Churchill, they will think of the Bengal famine in the 1940s. And if you don't actually understand this, then you don't understand some of the problems we have in the world now. Another classic one, the Iranians. I think I might have mentioned this before, but there are many Iranians that think they call the America's the great Satan, but Britain's the little Satan, because the British interfered many times in Iranian history, in particular in the 1950s, where we supported a coup, worked with the American CIA to have a coup to remove what we would nowadays call a nationalist prime minister who had come to power, wanted to nationalize the oil fields owned by British and Americans, and he was toppled. He was murdered. If you don't understand that, you'll never understand why some Iranians will have an irrational view of the British. It becomes quite rational if you follow that narrative and believe that narrative. Well, where are we at? Sorry, folks. Boots on the table with Dom. Great. Almost missed this morning. Good to have you with me, Dom. Thank you very much for your support as a member of my history channel. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed the most recent talk I gave as well about the Battle of Graveney Marsh in Kent in 1940, which claims, or some people claim, was the last battle on British soil. Not that boots on the table. If you followed it, you'll know it wasn't quite a Culloden or Sedgemoor or anything like that. Some questions will always crop up, like British starvation of India and Ireland. Yeah, and again, we talk about the Irish history. Most Brits, if you ask them about Ireland, there's the IRA, and by the IRA they really mean from late 60s, 1970 onwards. Okay, nothing to do with the IRA back in in the Second World War or anything like that. And they don't understand a lot of the history as to why, if you say the wrong thing at the wrong place to Irish friends living in the UK, let alone Irish friends in the Republic of Ireland, saying why people have the views they do, why certain Irish communities in America and Australia and New Zealand are as passionate as they are in their views, and indeed have views about the British. And I'm patriotic. I wouldn't do the videos I do if I'm not, okay? But I am also a realist and accept that actually I have a point of view, but others have one as well. And we're all creatures of our backgrounds and the narratives we've been told in our countries, aren't we? So what about the British and American campaigns in Russia in 1918, 1920? Invisible Ray, what a great one. Again, love to tell that. And again, it has resonations in Russia. The Russians believe the British always come into their country and interfere. Crimean War, trying to strangle the Bolshevik Revolution. And they almost neatly say, oh, yeah, the Tsars were good. And they don't necessarily defend the Tsars or Lenin, but it's the fact that the British turned up there. So, yeah, the American and British campaigns in Russia trying to prevent the Bolsheviks taking over, which history might say would have been a good idea, is something I will cover. That's a great idea, Invisible Ray. Thank you for that one. I will add it to my list. Okay, I'll show you the list in a while if I remember. Good morning from Canada. Good morning, Dalton. And again, another member of my membership channel. Thank you very much. Anyone who's interested, by the way, in membership, that's in the links below as well. And my grandfather passed away when I was young. He was in the Royal Navy. Is there any way to look at his service record? Ooh, I'm not 100% sure. Is there a way? I'm sure there is. I'm not sure where my starting point would be on that one. So if anyone has got some ideas to help here, where was the best place to start for looking up someone's Royal Navy career record? Please put it in the chat. And I'm not quite sure. Is it Aki? But however we pronounce it and whatever it means, is have a look in the chat. Hopefully people will respond for you. There's a lot of people here with a lot of information about history and military. So please, there's a UK war graves in Russia. Oh, okay. Sorry, I thought you were about to get help there. But thank you, QA Library. And Uncle Heavy, I'm with you here. Don't forget, as a YouTube presenter, everyone can see what I say. I don't mean now, I mean when I make a video, okay? And they can see this as well if they've actually sat through 30 minutes of it. But many of the appalling incidents of the British Empire, and there are a fair few, let's be honest, can be put down to incompetence, neglect, arrogance, and an overarching laissez-faire attitude. Yeah, and if you actually put them together, that's a hell of a cocktail, isn't it? You're surprised that anybody enjoyed having the British rule them based upon that. The one thing I will always say is two things, actually. One, British Empire there was never a blueprint for the British Empire. I think people think that somewhere there was a group of people, Gladstone, whoever it was, sitting in Whitehall in London with this master plan. Like, okay, we'll take out the Zulus, then we'll take out the Boers, then we'll go into Zimbabwe, and then maybe we'll see. Unfortunately, it never was like that. It was an empire as much as anything. It was an empire by mistake, by default, accidental empire. There was never a master plan. Unlike, say, Adolf Hitler believing that there was Lebensraum in the east of Europe for the Germans to inhabit at the expense of the Slavs. And in fairness, a lot of other empires didn't have these master plans either. The other thing to say is actually the British, yeah, good and bad. Influences, good and bad. Massive empire at the end of the day, bigger than the Roman Empire. But actually, most empire, number one, the British weren't the only people to ever have an empire, even in the 19th and 20th centuries. I'm currently reading Line in the Sand, all about the division of the Middle East between the British and the French at the end of the First World War, which has some roots in current problems in Palestine and Syria and Iraq and places like that. But interestingly, the real drivers for the imperial carve-up of the Middle East were the French, not the British, to a certain extent. Again, the British were making sure the French didn't grab too much of the Middle East. Good book, by the way, Line in the Sand. Right, can we move on? I've so far told you all about bloody Gladstone in 1868. Do people fancy finding out a little bit more what happened this week? The 4th of December, 1154. We're going back in time. This is safe. There wasn't a British Empire then. You know, what could possibly go wrong? 4th of December, 1154, Nicholas Breakspear is elected Pope. He was elected as Pope Adrian IV. He's the only Englishman to ever been elected Pope. He was born near St. Albans, started life in St. Albans Abbey, or St. Albans Monastery, St. Albans Abbey, but then spent most of his adult life actually abroad. Back in those days, a lot of the Catholic priests, and Europe was Catholic, or at least the western side of Europe was Catholic, they used to move around a lot. They were actually very cosmopolitan. So I don't mean hedonistic, I mean cosmopolitan. They would be like he was. He was born in Britain, but he went elsewhere and studied in other monasteries. And the common language was Latin. So they could almost, as long as you could speak Latin as a monk, you could be a monk in France, you could be a monk in Germany, you could be a monk in Italy if you wanted. And he spent most of his time abroad. He was only Pope for 5 years, 1154 to 1159. Probably the most significant thing he did. You'd think he might do some favors for England, like we've got our man in the job, so let's get some let's get some favors. The only favor really that happened, it was in the time of, he was Pope during Henry II's reign, and he gave a papal bull, which is almost like a papal, call it authority come get out of jail card. If you're trying to look modern stuff, Muslims will issue fatwas. It's sort of in that area. It isn't a fatwa, but it's called a papal bull, which is almost like you have the papal blessing, and as I am God's bishop on earth, that means you've got God's blessing too. William the Conqueror was given a papal bull, by the way, to invade England against Harold. And Henry II was given a papal bull to invade Ireland. Actually, what is interesting, and Henry II then produced this papal bull to say, I have a right to invade Ireland. And the interesting bit was he produced it years later. So he got it out of Nicholas Breakspear, or Pope Adrian IV, and then he sort of stuck it in his back pocket until he found a suitable time. And there's a lot of debate about, had he gone to Adrian at the time he actually invaded Ireland, whether Adrian would have given him a papal bull. Because it's rather like me saying, maybe there's a policeman who arrested you, pulled you over for speeding, and we know something about him, or we have a get out of jail free card, and we produce it 15 years later. You think it's somewhat after the event. But anyway, Henry II, papal bull from Adrian IV, otherwise known as Nicholas Breakspear, the only English pope in history. Full stop. How about that? I'll come back to some of the comments because you can tell I like listening to your comments. I like responding to them. 5th of December, 1905, the second of our prime ministers and second of our Liberal prime ministers coming into office, Henry Campbell-Bannerman in 1905. He actually came into office because the Conservative government fell, and the King asked him whether he could form a government. And basically, the Tories stood aside and basically said, yeah, go on, let's see you try and form a government. Let's see if you can do it. We think you'll rip your party apart. And funnily enough, the Liberal Party had two wings pulling each other. Sound familiar, anyone? But the government, he managed to square it off. He managed to get both his wings in. They formed a government. He was basically, there's always a vote in British Parliament. When the King or Queen asks you, can you form a government? You go to the House of Commons and you ask effectively for a vote. Nowadays, the party who's won the general election has a majority, normally in Parliament, and they will say, yes, we can form a government. They weren't necessarily in that situation, but he was able to form a government. He immediately actually then he called a general election, having united his party, formed a government. He then called a general election in early 1906, which the Liberals won by a landslide. It's one of the great political landslides of British history. And in 1906 they won, but it was actually in December 1905 that Campbell-Bannerman became Prime Minister. Campbell-Bannerman, interestingly, was from Glasgow, a Scotsman. He had been the Member of Parliament for Stirling since 1868, which interestingly, while he was Prime Minister, he was also given he achieved the honorary title of Father of the House. Father of the House in British Parliament, and it's different elsewhere in the world, okay? Some countries, it's about your age, the oldest person in Parliament. In Britain, this only applies in the House of Commons, by the way. In Britain, it was the Father of the House is the person with the longest service. So technically, you can have older MPs, but if I'm 82 and I've just been elected last year, I'm not the Father of the House. Someone who was elected at age 20, like one of these by-elections where you see like a Liberal, it tend to be a Liberal or Labour person who gets in as a real youngster or one of the nationalist parties, they could be still an MP age 60, so way below this 82-year-old who's just come into Parliament. But because they've had 40 years service as an MP, they're the Father of the House, if there's no one who's been serving longer, okay? And he became the Father of the House in 1907. When he became Prime Minister, 1905, he was already 69 years of age. But he basically served for 40 years as the MP for Stirling. I'm just going to make that hypothetical thing up just now about being an MP for 40 years. I've just looked at my notes and thought, actually, he was an MP for 40 years. He was Prime Minister from, let's say, December 1905 till Easter, April 1908. Interestingly, his government had some really interesting characters in it. President of the Board of Trade, David Lloyd George. Foreign Secretary, Henry Asquith. They were in the cabinet. Both became Liberal prime ministers after Campbell-Bannerman. Under Secretary of State for the Colonies, Winston Churchill, who incidentally, his first job as Under Secretary of State for the Colonies was to negotiate new constitutions for the conquered Boer territories of Transvaal and Orange Free State. And through Churchill's negotiations, not least with Louis Botha in South Africa, the Transvaal and the Orange Free State both got self-government inside the British Empire. A few years later, those two British colonies, as they were, Afrikaner-dominated British colonies, joined with the two English-dominated colonies in southern Africa, the Cape Colony and Natal, to form the Dominion of South Africa. So Churchill, he crops up everywhere, doesn't he? And the other interesting one is the Home Secretary was Herbert Gladstone, who was the son of William Gladstone, who we've mentioned just now. We won't go back to William Gladstone. I think we've done him to death for the minute, haven't we? But it's interesting, you get these political dynasties. And don't forget Churchill, of course. His father had been Chancellor of the Exchequer in the Conservative Party. And he was one of these young gun, ambitious men. Britain, I don't know how other nations do it, but we always like to have this, the prime minister we never had, the best prime minister we ever had, the best Labour prime minister we never had, or whatever. John Smith has that one, doesn't he, from the 1990s. And Randolph Churchill was definitely seen by many in the Conservative Party as this young radical who could have been a great prime minister. And likewise, Joseph Chamberlain, who we mentioned just now, another one who could have been, is mentioned as one of the great prime ministers Britain ever had. Arguable. It's interesting, isn't it? People are much better prime ministers when they didn't have to be. It's like all the people who could have been an English football manager, Brian Clough. We all like to think if anyone loves Cloughy, you all think he would have been a great England football manager. But he might not have been, but he's like the prince across the sea. We never know whether he would have been, and that's part of the mystique. 6th of December, another Liberal prime minister. I tell you, we're on a roll this week with prime ministers. 1916, 6th of December 1916, David Lloyd George. I've just mentioned him. He was the president of the Board of Trade back in 1905. He then followed up, he became the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Welsh Wizard, as he was called. And in 1916, in the middle of the First World War, David Lloyd George formed a coalition, a national government coalition between the Conservatives, the Liberals, and some of the Labour Party. Split the Liberal Party. A lot of people in the Liberals didn't really like Lloyd George. They certainly didn't like the fact he was very close to the Conservatives by the end of the war. And many remained loyal to Asquith, who he had ousted. I'll come back to comments in a moment. I've just seen another few that is going to get me going down a rabbit hole. And anyway, David Lloyd George became Prime Minister, last Liberal Prime Minister Britain ever had. But he was still in Parliament up until the 1940s. But he was Prime Minister 1916 to 1922. Enough of that one. Let me just come back to some of your things here. Someone QA Library, thank you very much for coming back about the question about records for the Royal Navy. Start with the Imperial War Museum or the Royal Navy Museum in Greenwich. Yeah, good shouts, both of those. Thank you for that. Anything on the Korean War? If you mean anything on the Korean War regarding my videos, I've done one, only one so far, but there are more to come. The Korean War seems very popular, and interestingly, very popular with viewers in Korea, which is very nice. But I did one about the glorious Gloucesters and the Battle of Imjin River. It's actually one of my most viewed videos. So by all means, have a look at that. Great story of sacrifice, very unknown story in many respects, very known if you're from Gloucestershire or into Korean military war, Korean War military history. But actually, most folk don't really don't even know. Most Brits don't even know we were in Korea, quite frankly. But then I guess we've been in so many blinking wars, haven't we? You know, everyone remembers the ones their families were in. But have I ever been to the Cheshire Regiments Museum? They have Captain Oates' Polar Medal there. I've been to the Cheshire Regiments Museum. I haven't seen the Polar Medal, but then in fairness, my son, I was taking him around at the time. He was about 5. So it was more like watching where the hell this small child had gone than looking at all the cabinets. So thank you for that. I will go and look for that as I keep going and visiting my kids or my son who lives up in Cheshire. I'll go and take a time to visit that. Tim Watson, I believe Louis Botha was responsible for gifting the Cullinan diamond to the crown. I wonder if it was something of a bribe. Might have been. Don't know. Interesting. Some of the crown jewel stories are actually interesting as well. I'd like to tell those because they are, again, murky like that. You know, Cullinan diamond should live in South Africa. Well, it was gifted by the Prime Minister of South Africa to Britain. So it wasn't like it was stolen. You know, it wasn't like, you know, the British Army rocked up and grabbed a diamond that they shouldn't have had. So good to know some of the stories behind it and the reasons why. And the Koh-i-Noor diamond is absolutely one that really should, because that's got a history and a half, of which the British only have a small part of that history. But it's been a prize in wars. The Persians, the Afghans, the Sikhs, the British. It's done the rounds. It's just out of the sort of South Asia now, but it did the rounds. So anyway. It might have been a gift made at gunpoint, Uncle Heavy. Yeah, I think actually the British, if you look at some of the stuff with Louis Botha we're talking about there, with the thing, I'm guessing, I think the British were in one of those situations that the British were desperately trying to get the Boers back on side. So I don't think it was at gunpoint. I actually think the previous Tim's comment was probably more likely, actually. It's like, oh, look at this lovely diamond, and by the way, can we speak Dutch in our schools or something like that? I think it would be much more like that. Hello, Jerry. Good day, my good man. My good man. Thank you very much. How are you? Fine. Thank you very much. Someone saying in Texas, what is your favorite time from history, for history? If you talk about period rather than what time should I be speaking to you now, don't know. Favorite period? Well, obviously the Victorian period. I enjoy most history, and the more I get into it, the more you uncover, and the more you think, oh God, I wish I'd learned this before. I have a fascination with the Anglo-Saxon period. I find that intriguing. I also think that where are we at? I think Victorian is interesting as well, because just because we're living with so much of the Victorian, what the Victorians did. I don't just mean the military stuff, okay, but you know, the London Underground, the London sewage system, the railways that cross Britain, you know, the public libraries, the public buildings that we have, all came from the Victorian period. So yeah, I think the Victorian period links to our modern day in a way that trying to trawl back to Anglo-Saxon England doesn't, or Pictish Scotland or something like that. But I do find that whole era pre-1066, and interesting actually, post-1066, I'm starting to get a bit interested in as now. So I could be a politician, couldn't I? Because I've just covered off everyone. Everyone gets a vote. Oh, should I mention actually, I don't really do the Tudors, but I am getting really into the Stuarts. I'm going to do a series about the Stuarts in January. Sorry, I'm going to do a series about the Civil War in January, English Civil War. But as I'm researching it, you realise just what an interesting bunch and how much happened in the time the Stuarts were on the throne of England in particular. Okay, and of course it was under the Stuarts that we ended up with a Great Britain. So up until then, we had two separate countries: England and Wales, and Scotland. So there you go. I live close to the Imjin River. Being a Brit, I'm thankful for the service of the British soldiers in that pivotal moment in the war. Yeah, by all means, please do look up the glorious Gloucesters at Imjin River. It's a fascinating one. Anyone who is interested in that period of history, I thoroughly recommend the Friends of the Gloucesters Regiment Museum, which is down not far from Gloucester Quays in Gloucester, and indeed Gloucester Cathedral, where there are several mementos and a little stone cross that was carved by the commanding officer of the Gloucesters while he was a prisoner in Korea in pretty awful circumstances. I wouldn't quite call it as bad as maybe the Japanese POW camps of the Second World War, but they weren't far behind. Okay, definitely on a par with what American servicemen during the Vietnam War had to put up with when they were prisoners. So we've done Henry Campbell-Bannerman, we've done William Gladstone, we've done David Lloyd George. Takes me to our fourth Prime Minister in a week. Okay, 7th of December, 1783. William Pitt the Younger becomes Prime Minister, aged 24. Yep, you heard that absolutely right. He was aged 24. He became Prime Minister. He basically was then Prime Minister. He is the second longest serving Prime Minister in British history, and served up until into the early part, basically just as the Napoleonic Wars themselves had started. So he was Prime Minister all the way through the French Revolutionary Wars. He was Prime Minister when we had the Spithead Mutiny in the Royal Navy. He was Prime Minister during the United Irishmen's revolt in Ireland, obviously. He introduced income tax. He was the Prime Minister who introduced income tax. It was a short-term measure to pay for the war against revolutionary France. And here we are in 2023, still paying income tax, shed loads of it. So I'd like to think some of that money maybe goes to Napoleon in the film Napoleon or something like that, but I don't think. So David Lloyd, going to Pitt the Younger a lot more. I went into his story this week a lot more in my newsletter. As I said, I mentioned the newsletter earlier. There's a link down below if you want to sign up. Every week, I tell you what the latest podcast and YouTube videos are. I, as I say, tell you all the dates from British history. We do different ones to these, mix and match. And I always tell a written form one of the stories from there. This week's was all about William Pitt the Younger. And it's interesting, of course, because he ties in many respects to my video this week about the Battle of Waterloo, same period, ever so slightly later, Battle of Waterloo. But and just a few others I'm going to kick off because we're getting towards the top of the hour. 8th of December, 1745, Bonnie Prince Charlie turns his army around at Derby. Bonnie Prince Charlie had, this is the Stuarts I was just mentioning, fascinating group of people. We're now into the Hanoverians. The House of Hanover were the kings of Britain at this time. We were on George II, the second of the Hanoverian kings by the stage. But they had ultimately come to power through a coup inside the House of Stuart, I hasten to add, where the Catholic King James II had been kicked off the throne by his Protestant daughter. The throne then went to her Protestant daughter, and Parliament then passed a law to say no Catholic could inherit the throne. So they had to hunt around when Queen Anne died. They had to hunt around and find the nearest Protestant in the line of succession. And eventually they found one over in Germany, in the little Principality of Hanover. So we had George I, Prince of Hanover and King of England and Scotland, and then it went to George II. Meanwhile, of course, the Stuarts were alive and well through James II's son, and it was James II's grandson, Charles Edward Stuart, who landed in Scotland, raised rebellion to seize the thrones of Scotland and England, and indeed Ireland, actually, back for the House of Stuart. And for his dad, his granddad James II is now dead, but for his dad. So there's this bit of the myth. We have these historic narratives, our national narratives that we all believe. There is a narrative, isn't there, that Bonnie Prince Charlie was fighting for Scottish independence. He was the sort of the 1745 version of Nicola Sturgeon or Alex Salmond. Far from it, actually. He was using the Scots to try and get the throne of England as well. He wasn't going to live in Edinburgh in the rain when he could have Hampton Court Palace or something like that. So he raised an army in Scotland. They were successful initially, defeated the British government's forces in Scotland, came south of the border, reached as far as Derby. So we're not far from London. We're just over 100 miles from London. And it was at that stage that he was advised by some of his generals, Scottish generals who were with him, that there was a government army coming towards him, and really they didn't have the numbers to fight a government army in the middle of government territory, England. So retreat back to Scotland at least would be on some sort of home turf. I mean, admittedly, Charles Edward Stuart wasn't on home turf because he'd spent most of his life in France, actually. That's home turf for him. But for the Scottish chieftains, Highland chieftains, and that, if we're going to fight and die, we'll do it in Scotland. Maybe north of the border, we might be able to have some sort of negotiation with the government to say, well, can we have Scottish independence and we will leave you alone. Government were having none of that. And ultimately, of course, it ended up at the Battle of Culloden the following year. But on the date, 8th of December, 1745, the furthest point south Bonnie Prince Charlie reached, actually Folkestone Bridge, just south of the city of Derby, and they turned around and started a retreat all the way back that took them right to the very, almost the top of Scotland, near Inverness, the following year, to the battlefield of Culloden. Very eerie battlefield, that place. Yeah. Do I believe in ghosts? Not sure, but certainly it gives you the EGBGs when you're there, especially there's a bit of mist. And there's some playing the bagpipes in the distance, which, yeah, if you want an atmosphere, Culloden, definitely a place to go for that. And last one for you, actually last two, 8th of December, 1914, the Battle of the Falkland Islands. Yes, we're not talking about Margaret Thatcher and General Galtieri. We're talking about the Battle of the Falkland Islands, 1914. It was a naval battle. Long story short, because I've got a video about that, and actually I've posted a link below, so have a look down there for that. But long story short, there was a German naval fleet based in their colony in China, where they again, all part of imperial European and American imperialism in the end of the 19th century. But the Germans ended up with a port in China called Tsingtao. Those of you who go to Chinese restaurants and have Tsingtao beer, that's where it came from. That's why they make lager beer, because it was a German lager factory in their German colony of Tsingtao. So anyway, First World War broke out. They were stuck across the other side of the world. The German fleet under Admiral von Graf Spee decided to try and get back to Europe. They came right across the Pacific from China, not a bad thing, round the Cape Horn, whilst just off the coast of Chile. They defeated a Royal Naval fleet, a small Royal Naval fleet, at the Battle of Coronel. I'll do that story sometime next year as well, because that's a fascinating one. First British naval defeat since the Napoleonic Wars, or about the wars of revolutionary France. So over 100 years since the Royal Navy had been defeated, and it was a real wake-up call. Admittedly, it was a pretty outdated fleet that came up against these Germans, who they had pretty state-of-the-art fleet. But nevertheless, first time the Brits had been caught with their pants down like that. Came around Cape Horn and basically were met off, another fleet had gathered and met them off the Falkland Islands, and 8 out of the 10 German ships were sunk, 1,800 odd men drowned or killed, including Admiral Graf Spee, Graf von Spee, Spee. And only 2 ships got away: an auxiliary ship, a bit like a supply boat, a steamer, tramp steamer, cargo boat, and one destroyer, the Dresden. And the Dresden went back round the Cape Horn, went into the Pacific Ocean, really on an aimless mission now. I mean, chances of getting back to Germany were diddly squat. And there was a major hunt for the Dresden. The other interesting one, 10 ships left, well, actually it was 11 ships, left China in the German fleet. One decided not to come across the Pacific with von Spee, and that was the Emden. And the Emden went into the Indian Ocean. And I've done a video about the Emden. Unfortunately, I've gone off cuff here, gone off piste, so I haven't got a description. I'll see if I can put it in later, or a link, sorry, to the video, but the Emden, great story, really interesting story. Sorry, Dresden was a light cruiser. Do beg your pardon, Tasha. Yeah, thank you very much indeed for that. Thank you. Sister of the Emden, absolutely. So there you go. So Emden's there. What do we have here? 8th of December, USA made Churchill's Day by entering the war. Yes, Darren, absolutely. Churchill probably couldn't believe his luck. If I was watching a program recently, actually, and they were talking about Hitler making mistakes in the Second World War, and they said his two greatest mistakes. One was invading Soviet Union, and the other one was declaring war on Germany. On America, because of course he declared war on the Yanks. The Yanks had been attacked at Pearl Harbor. They definitely had a beef with the Japanese, but Germany. There was no reason why they had to go into a war with Germany. Germany were in an alliance with Japan, but technically, when you have an alliance, it's to protect a member or a fellow member of the alliance when they're attacked. Right at that minute in time, the Americans weren't doing any attacking on the Japanese. They were on the receiving end. They declared war on Japan, and and then Hitler decided he would declare war on Germany. So and Roosevelt decided that whilst they were fighting in the Pacific, that actually Hitler was a bigger danger, and diverted a lot of resources to Europe in the Second World War. So there you go. Last one, very quickly, 9th of December, 1899. This is it links to a video that I've put in the description. But 9th of December, 1899, the British start to maneuver through the night to attack the Boer positions. We're back to the Boer War here, folks, at Stormberg. It was the actual Battle of Stormberg took place on the 10th of December, the following day, so into next week, as in my history talks. But they actually started going through the night. They were going to outflank the Boers and basically either get the Boers to surrender or retreat. During the night, they managed to completely screw up their advance. They ended up in the wrong position. And the following day, the Battle of Stormberg was a complete disaster for the British. They ended up outgunned by the Boers. 700 British soldiers captured. This is the Queen Victoria's army, who beats everyone. And these Dutch farmers had just taken 700 of them captive. Psychologically, again, massive impact for the British, a bit like the Battle of Coronel I mentioned just now. The British never had a setback like that. Maybe Isandlwana in the Zulu War, but they never had 700 men actually captured, because the Zulus didn't do capturing of British soldiers in the Zulu War. They killed them, but they never had 700 captured. And this was the first of 3 defeats the British were to suffer at the hands of the Boers in what was dubbed by the British press Black Week, and we'll be talking more about that next week. So I hope you enjoyed that sort of ramble through history. I'm not going to go into Waterloo today, except to say released a video last night about Waterloo. There's a link in the description as well. So by all means, have a look at that. And what's really fascinating for me is that, and it doesn't come across in the film, of Napoleon, the latest one, didn't really come across necessarily in the film Waterloo, which I have to say was done slightly better than Napoleon. But that Wellington and excuse me. Wellington and Napoleon were actually born in the same year, 1769. Wellington was about 3 months older. They've both fought their first battles within a year of each other. And their careers from 1793, I think it was, where they both fought, 1793 and 1794, they both fought their first battles, Napoleon first, then Wellington. Their careers, both were massive trajectories. We all know about Napoleon. Wellington had 30 victories. He was no shirker when it came to military victories, not least in the Peninsular War, but also earlier in India, where he notched up some notable successes against Mysore and also the Marathas. And they didn't meet. They'd never met in battle till Waterloo in 1815. It's almost like in boxing, where you've got these different belts you can wear for in heavyweight boxing. Such and such a champion. It was almost like both of them held. Probably Napoleon held 2 belts, and Wellington held 1. And in all these years, they're like almost undefeated champions. They'd never actually come up against each other until Waterloo. And it's as much a battle of 2 commanders as it was of 2 armies. But I hope you enjoyed the video. Loads of people have watched it already, which is lovely, always good. And Lots of fallout from Waterloo. I'm going to be doing a talk about the Peninsular War next time. Okay, next week. So one to look out for. Top line: Peninsular War. What was it all about? And of course, there's other fallout. The history of St. Helena, where Napoleon went to, and of course some of Britain's islands. All these little islands in the Atlantic, which you wonder why the hell did Britain have them, like Ascension Island and St. Helena and Tristan da Cunha. Tristan da Cunha and Ascension Island became British colonies because the British basically said, well, we'll have forces. They actually stationed garrisons on both those two remote islands to prevent the French using them as launch pads to try and rescue Napoleon on St. Helena. And all three of those islands, St. Helena, Tristan da Cunha, Ascension Island, are all still British overseas territories to this day. Other thing I will say is that I'm looking to do a video about Woodbine Willie. Some of you are thinking that's probably a saucy comment or something weird. If you remember, Woodbine Willie was in my talk last week about Reverend Theodore Hardy, VC, British Army chaplain, awarded the Victoria Cross in the First World War. He was given advice when he became a chaplain by a man called the Reverend Geoffrey Stoddart Kennedy, who was known to the troops, another British Army chaplain, who was known to the troops as Woodbine Willie. And interesting character. He was awarded the Military Cross in his own right as a chaplain. But what was interesting is I went to Worcester Cathedral last week. There was actually a big Christmas market in Worcester. I thought much better than I was expecting as well, by the way. And I went into the cathedral where they had more stalls, like craft stalls and things. Anyway, I was looking around the cathedral and blow me down. There was this display about Woodbine Willie, Reverend Kennedy. And it transpires that he was, before the First World War, he was a vicar in Worcester. He returned after the war. He survived the war, unlike Theodore Hardy. He survived the war, and he comes back to Worcester. He died in the 1920s, and he's buried in Worcester. And there in Worcester Cathedral is this display about him. He actually appears in the Millennium Window. They've got this Millennium Window, which is this glass. It's not a stained glass window. It's almost like a glass etching. And there is Woodbine Willie with his service hat on, First World War helmet, and a packet of fags, Woodbines, in his hand. Interestingly, when he died and he was buried in Worcester, as I say, funeral procession was attended by thousands in Worcester in the 1920s. And as his cortege passed, people threw packets of Woodbines onto the coffin, which is it's quite cool, isn't it, really? So I'm thinking about doing Woodbine Willie. I think it's going to be one of those sort of niche ones. I get the feeling it's not going to be up there with Colour Sergeant Ball or the Imogen River or the Gloucesters. But hopefully some of you might enjoy that. And if you think it's interesting or would like me to waste my time putting a video together, it'll be a short one. It won't be one of my long 20 minutes, more likely a 10-minute or something like that. Give me a shout. So there you go. Over the hour. Hope you've had your money's worth. I've thoroughly enjoyed chatting to you as ever. I hope you found it interesting. A little bit low key, yeah, not quite as highbrow maybe as my long form videos that I do here on YouTube. We've already got. Please do Woodbine Willie. Sounds fantastic. Oh, thank you very much, and thank you, Boots on Table. Great video on Waterloo. Thank you very much indeed. Have I read the book about King's German Legion? No, but fascinating history. The King's German Legion. Might do a story about them. Okay, because that's interesting. I also like to do a story about some of the Americans who left America at the end of the American Revolutionary Wars and end up in the British Armed Forces. Thanks for the live stream. Well, thank you all. Okay, have a lovely weekend. If you want more exclusive videos, then please support my work by becoming a member. That just means I get a little bit of money, so I can actually invest in a bit more technology. I want to get a desktop, so I can start to produce some better quality live videos, better quality videos for you as well. And I'm doing all this off a laptop at the minute, so money well spent if you support, and in return you get some exclusive videos. So thank you very much, everyone, for your support. Have a lovely weekend. And I'll see you next week. And look out for the videos about Woodbine Willie and the Peninsular War. Also got one coming up. I might do one for my members about the history of British pantomime, because it goes back a lot further than you might think. Anyway, thanks very much for your time. Have a lovely weekend. Take care. See you very soon.